Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this very special event we have prepared for you. Now, before we begin, I did want to take a moment to mention that I'm joining you today from the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin First Nation, and it's now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We recognize the valuable past, present, and future contributions of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit as customary keepers and defenders of this territory. Now, as settlers, we recognize this as a first step in a long journey towards decolonization and a move towards reconciliation. The truth is that colonization is alive and well, both here in Canada and, as we're going to discuss today, elsewhere in the world. Now, my name is Caroline Leal, and I'm a content and creative specialist at Oxfam Canada. I lead our work on content production and storytelling, and along with our teams for the past 8 months, a great deal of our work has been focused on communicating and advocating for a ceasefire and humanitarian access to Gaza, as well as stopping Canadian arms transfers to Israel. And joining us today is Lauren Ravon, Executive Director of Oxfam Canada. Lauren is a committed social justice advocate with more than 15 years of international development experience, and she's been with Oxfam Canada since 2011. So thank you so much for joining us today, Lauren.
Thanks, everyone. It's great to be here today.
Lauren and I recently traveled to the occupied Palestinian territory, specifically the West Bank. And today we'll be sharing our experiences, the people we met, and how we can continue being in solidarity with the people of Palestine. Now, if you have a question you'd like to ask, please click on the Q&A button below, and we'll go through a few of them in the next 45 minutes. So let's get to it. Lauren, maybe you could get us started with a few words, and then you could tell us why you decided to recently travel to Palestine and Israel. Like, what were you hoping to get out of the trip?
Thanks, Carol. First, I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone who is on this webinar today, but also all the people from across Canada that have been standing with Oxfam in our fight for human rights and justice over the past 8 months. So many of you have made generous donations, taken action with us, sent letters to your MP or to the Prime Minister, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, have signed petitions, have taken to the streets. That power of the Oxfam network in Canada has been tremendous, and the impacts of that have been felt by our colleagues in Gaza and the West Bank, who are seeing this mobilization in Canada and wanted me to extend their thanks to you for standing in solidarity with them. So to your question, Caro, the reason that I traveled to Jerusalem and the West Bank a couple of weeks ago was really two-part. One was to be able to meet with colleagues, Oxfam colleagues who are running our humanitarian operations in Gaza today, and also other actors, UN officials who we work with to coordinate our humanitarian response, to really understand the challenges we're facing and how we can scale up our response in the coming weeks and months. The second purpose of the visit was really to bear witness today. And the situation in the West Bank rarely makes the news. I'm sure many of you do not see evening headlines on the West Bank. And yet, over the past 8 months, there's been an incredible surge of violence in the West Bank. Over 500 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank, and we're seeing an increased crackdown on freedom of movement, more checkpoints, more barriers to Palestinians in the West Bank being able to work and move around freely. So a real sense of increased oppression, human rights violation, and also a real economic strangulation of the West Bank since the start of the war. So I wanted to travel to the region to meet with our teams. We have Oxfam offices in Jerusalem and in Ramallah, meet with our teams and really bear witness to what they have been experiencing over the past 8 months.
Now, we're going to focus obviously on the West Bank, but I did want to also take some time to speak about Gaza. Now, it's quite incredible that Oxfam staff in Gaza, while themselves, fleeing for their lives, they're still working to coordinate Oxfam's response. Can you tell everyone a little bit about what you heard? How are they coping on a day-to-day basis?
This situation is so incredibly unusual. I can't stress this enough that, Oxfam responds to humanitarian emergencies around the world in very complicated settings. But in Gaza, it is exceptional, where our own staff, our own Oxfam colleagues are not only trying to deliver aid, their fellow men, women, and children in the communities that they live in, but they're also running for their lives. They have been on the move for the last 8 months. All of our colleagues have been displaced multiple times. Almost all of our colleagues have either had their homes destroyed or severely damaged or had to flee the areas that their homes are in. Many of our colleagues and their families are now living in Oxfam offices or warehouses. This is the reality of humanitarian aid workers today, that they are both delivering aid and on the front lines of the war and feeling the terrible impacts of it. While I was in the region, I was very fortunate to be able to have a video call with all of my colleagues in Gaza. We're very thankful that the communication lines held. And some of my colleagues who I hadn't seen in many months were visibly impacted by hunger. They had lost a lot of weight and really seemed much more frail than before the war started. Another one of my colleagues, an amazing young woman, one of the few Oxfam staff who are still in the north of Gaza, told us about how she had lost 36 family members in the war so far. 36 people had been killed in her family alone. But what really stuck with me from what she told us is that beyond losing those family members, what had been hardest so far for her and her loved ones was knowing that they were being to death. She said that feeling of knowing you're being starved, of going hungry, not knowing if you're going to make it to the end of the week because there is so little food available. She said it was one of the most frightening things she had ever experienced. So this is the reality our teams are facing, our colleagues. And yet, as you said, Caho, despite it all, they are still working. That's what's incredible. They're providing aid, water and sanitation, food deliveries, working with our partners to strategize on how to move with populations as they're displaced and continue providing aid along the way. I cannot say how incredible these colleagues are and how very thankful I am that all 23 Oxfam staff in Gaza are still alive today.
Can you explain a little bit more about the role of the UN in all of this, and how does it connect with Oxfam? Are they able to deliver aid?
So, international organizations like Oxfam and others, we rely on the United Nations to help coordinate the delivery of aid within Gaza. So, an organization like Oxfam is able to purchase goods, food, water and sanitation supplies, and all the rest. We can purchase those goods, get them to the border with Gaza, but then once inside Gaza, we rely on UN trucks to get, from point A to point B. So, to get goods that Oxfam has purchased to Oxfam warehouses, for example. So we coordinate very directly with UN officials, but it's incredibly challenging. And those are part of the conversations that I had when I was there with UN officials, is to understand what are the barriers to getting aid to the areas where people need it most. Within Gaza, so the whole Gaza Strip, there are about 230 UN trucks delivering aid. It's very few. And we're all relying on these same trucks. Now, the UN needs to coordinate with Israeli Defense Forces to have access to roads to move around Gaza. And that access is incredibly controlled and restricted. And it means that sometimes trucks will be waiting days and days and days on end at one point because they're not allowed to circulate. And we also know that for these convoys, these aid convoys, it's incredibly dangerous. We've had dozens of humanitarian workers killed in Gaza since the start of the war. So every time a humanitarian aid truck goes out, it's a dangerous situation for them. And so we continue to coordinate, but I want to be honest, the challenges are immense. We are able to get aid to civilian populations, but it is more difficult than in any humanitarian setting we have ever worked in our 80-year history.
And now Oxfam has been working in the occupied Palestinian territory for many decades, including in the West Bank. And something that stood out to me was really like witnessing the impact of the situation in Gaza, but on Palestinians in the West Bank. Could you share with everyone about how they're dealing with the situation at this point in time? We heard of many that have family inside Gaza and they want to support them. Like, what can they do?
Yeah. So when we talk about the occupied Palestinian territory, it's actually two pieces of land. So you have the Gaza Strip along the ocean, and then you have the West Bank. This all comprises Palestinian land, but they are disconnected. So there's no physical connection between those two pieces of land. And since the beginning of the war in Gaza, the situation in the West Bank has become incredibly tense. It's basically a lockdown situation where it's very difficult for Palestinians living in the West Bank to have any freedom of movement. For example, we have offices both in Ramallah and East Jerusalem. And when I was going from one area to the other, my Palestinian colleagues could not accompany me because Palestinians living in Ramallah cannot have access to the city of Jerusalem 20 kilometers or so away. So that kind of restriction of movement. Also, when I was there, my Palestinian colleagues would often arrive many hours late to meetings that we were going to because they drive in cars that have separate license plates that don't allow them to drive on the main roads that are controlled by Israeli forces. They face checkpoint after checkpoint after checkpoint, where often they'll be detained, harassed. So kind of that real oppressive sense that you're living on your land and yet you have no freedom of movement. In cities like Ramallah, many storefronts are closed. You really sense that economic activity has come to a halt. Previously, many people living in the West Bank would go to Israel to work for the day and come back. None of those workers are allowed to cross over the border. So they've lost their jobs and income for their families. And then, as I said, there's been a major uptick in violence, of settler violence in the West Bank, where Palestinians are killed and increasingly losing their land, their access to water. It's an incredibly difficult situation that doesn't make the news enough. And again, that's one of the reasons why by going, I wanted to kind of raise alarm bells around what's happening in the West Bank.
I remember actually one of our colleagues, I remember a conversation with her. She was a videographer, and she was showing me on her phone all these videos and photos of her life in Ramallah pre-October 7th, of all, her outings with friends, dancing and, to restaurants and going, for a swim. And today, all those places are shut. More and more checkpoints, like you just mentioned, are in place. Permits are nearly impossible to come by. I could tell that she was really holding on to these images and videos like such precious cargo, reminders on her phone of another life. And I'm just wondering, what are some of some of the stories that you heard from families in the West Bank that really stood out to you?
There were so many. I felt like in one day I lived a lifetime in my trip in the West Bank. One thing that really stuck with me, we got to visit the Jordan Valley, which is really the kind of agricultural heart of the region, where most of fruits and vegetables are produced, previously for export. And in the Jordan Valley, what is so stark is that you can be driving on the road, and literally on one side, the land is green and you have palm trees and it's all lush and beautiful. And on the other side of the land, it is dry. It is dusty land with almost nothing growing on it. And what we learned when we were there is that that used to be Palestinian land, where farmers farmed for generation. And now there's increasing encroachment by settlers of the region. So settlers are taking over agricultural land. Not only that, but also deviating water supply to the land that they have taken over. And so Palestinians who used to be able to rely on water sources to irrigate their lands, that's over. And so not only have they been seeing their land taken away from them, but also any kind of economic future for themselves and their families. It was so sad to see kind of the lack of produce on one side and then very exportable produce on the other side. It was really stark. Maybe something else that stood with me. It's a detail, but it really spoke to me. I met with a woman in Ramallah who was saying that her father was from Jerusalem, and he kind of had fond memories of Jerusalem, which is an incredibly beautiful city. And she was talking about the fact that her two sons had never been to Jerusalem and had probably no likelihood of going anytime in the future. And Jerusalem was about 20 kilometers from where we were having that conversation. That's what it means to have no freedom of movement. You cannot even go to the city that is about an hour drive away from where you are, where your family is from, where your grandfather's home is, because of these checkpoints, of this restriction on the freedom of movement. She was tearing up, saying she wanted to describe Jerusalem to her boys so that they could at least feel what that city was like. And I, as someone coming to the region, could drive between the two, in a matter of an hour. That really, really struck with me. And then maybe one other thing, in a rural area, I met with a community, a Bedouin community that were living in kind of a small plot of land that had been provided by Oxfam and partners, because they had been recently driven off their land by settlers who had attacked them, beat them up, deliberately broken all of their solar panels, destroyed their access to water, their water pumps. And so now they had nowhere left to live. They were now staying in this kind of small tent encampment. But these are herder communities. They had sheep that now no longer had land to graze. Not only had they been violently attacked and displaced, but you could sense they were so uprooted and really had no prospects for the future. And that's what it felt like in so many conversations when I was in the West Bank. It was to say people are kind of standing by thinking, what is ahead? What future do I have for myself, for my family, when everything is being clawed away from me?
Yeah. And I think it's important to note too that this escalation really, this level of oppression has been happening for years and decades, but really there's been an augmentation since October. And I think that's, important to understand when we make the links between the West Bank and Gaza. Um, it's hard, it's difficult to witness, to feel this level of oppression, and you feel it as soon as you land. What was most shocking to you? What was there one moment that really shocked you when thinking of these oppressive day-to-day life?
Mean, there was something shocking being with my colleagues, so people that I, work with remotely on a day-to-day basis, incredible professionals who I have such respect for, witnessing kind of the daily harassment and intimidation and humiliation that they have to, live with, from the checkpoints, from hell that they have to go to get from one point to another, and yet remaining resilient and dignified in the face of really constant humiliation. It was really something. In particular, one day, a group of us were walking through the old city of Hebron, which is, to be honest, a very creepy place because all the storefronts are closed. You can sense this incredible tension where there's, towers with military personnel looking down on you. There's settlers up above. It's very, very tense. And we were walking through the street. There weren't many people, and we got to a checkpoint, and an Israeli soldier was screaming at our group, asking who was Muslim, if we had any Muslim colleagues, and they needed to be identified on the spot. And, these are people carrying machine guns, screaming at my Oxfam colleagues to identify who is Muslim in the group. It was really, really terrifying. The of discrimination there was so palpable. And yet again, my colleagues, are incredibly stoic and resilient in the face of that level of just violence and human rights violation based on identity and on religion.
There was a pretty exceptional evening, a special evening where we met with Israeli human rights organizations. Can you explain a little bit more about that evening and how exactly are they trying to influence the situation?
Yeah. Maybe I could start by saying that when we talk about our work on Gaza or Palestine, people often ask, "Oh, what about the Jewish community? How are you, interacting with the Jewish community?" And it's really important to understand that Oxfam has partners in Palestine, in Israel. For us, the common thread is a defense of human rights and international humanitarian law. That's really our guiding principle. And so we work with organizations on both sides in the West Bank, organizations that are based in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, because they're focused on advancing human rights. And Cajo, that evening, we met with the leaders of 4 incredibly resilient Israeli human rights organizations that are fighting for all human rights, and in particular, the human rights of the Palestinian people who are living under Israeli occupation. One of the women, she was incredible. She was, somehow resilient and optimistic in the face of it all. Her organization is dedicated to working in the defense of Palestinians who have been illegally jailed in Israeli jails. And she does a lot of work with kind of a hotline where families can call to try to figure out where their loved ones have been detained. And her organization searches for them, so goes and try to figure out who is detained where, and then advocates on their behalf. So they have a team of a legal aid team that work on their behalf. We also met an organization that's called Breaking the Silence, that's made up of former Israeli military personnel who have now kind of, in their time in the Israeli forces, witnessed the levels of occupation, of violence, of harassment of Palestinian people in the West Bank, and who are now kind of committed to speaking up about it, not just to speak up about it, but to try to change the hearts and minds of their fellow Israeli citizens to understand that level of violence and oppression that is right next door to them. It was inspiring to hear of these organizations doing this work, but I can also say it was a hard conversation because, they're facing an upward battle in terms of speaking about human rights in, in a country, in a geopolitical setting that is so tense and where lines are so firmly drawn. These are organizations that believe that you have to put human rights first, and that's going to pave the way to peace. And that is very much what Oxfam believes in. And, it's great to find allies and organizations we can work with in Gaza, in Israel, in the West Bank to do this work. We just want more voices to be speaking up for human rights, for international humanitarian law, and knowing that if there is any way out of this situation, far beyond the ceasefire, far beyond the immediate delivery of humanitarian aid, if there's any hope for peace, it's going to come from leaders, from all walks of life in all parts of society that are going to stand up and say enough is enough with the denial of people's basic human rights.
Yeah, and that actually that brings me to my next question. So Oxfam, we've been calling for Canada to support a permanent ceasefire and to stop the arms transfer to Israel. Do you feel that the Canadian government is doing all it can to support an end to this situation? And do you believe that our campaigning is making a difference?
Well, that I would say yes, it is making a difference. From day one, right in October, Oxfam was out pushing for a ceasefire, calling on Canada to get alongside the growing global movement calling for a ceasefire. And I am pretty convinced that the government would not have gone on board with that so quickly if we hadn't had literally hundreds of thousands of Canadians demanding it. So many of you signed petitions, went to protest, called your MP, wrote to the Prime Minister, wrote to the Minister of Foreign Affairs saying Canada needs to be on the right side of history here. Canada needs to call for a ceasefire. That made a difference. This I know. Something else that we've been working on is calling for countries to suspend arms trade with Israel. Obviously, if you're selling arms that are then killing civilians, that is part of the problem. And we're doing that here in Canada, but interesting, the strength of the global Oxfam Confederation is that we have campaigners and supporters in, Paris and in London and in The Hague, and in Berlin calling for an end to arms transfers. And that's what makes the strength of advocacy, when you can connect across the world with a unified message. And countries look at what others are doing. They feel they feel that pressure. And Canada, the Canadian government, certainly feels the movement towards stopping arms transfer, and we're contributing to that. There's still a ways to go, and there's definitely more that Canada can do, but I do think that advocacy works. And Oxfam's kind of general way of working is that we provide humanitarian aid when needed, but we want to look at what is causing the conflict or the crisis in the first place. And you can't do one without the other. We need to be on the ground for people right now when they need us, but we also need to be speaking up and raising our voice, because we can do it. We have that liberty to speak up. We need to use it.
Yeah, and our Palestinian, we've heard firsthand from our Palestinian colleagues and partners how much they appreciate and they see your posts, they see your shares, they see marching in the streets. So it's so much appreciated. Thank you so much, Lauren. I do believe we have time for a few questions. So I'm going to look in my tab here for a few of the questions. So the first one, and I'm just going to read it here. So do all aid agencies have to use the UN trucks, or are there some Palestinian agencies who have their own supply lines? And it's a bit of a three-parter. And has there been any problem getting funds into Oxfam or in Gaza specifically, or wherever, our closest bases?
So I wouldn't say every bit of aid distribution is coordinated through the UN, but the vast majority is. Then there's always kind of self-help mechanisms within any community. And we see this in every humanitarian response. I think we often think the humanitarian organizations are the first to provide aid, but they're not. It's people themselves helping their neighbors, helping their communities. And so that's already happening in Gaza. People are getting things from one place to the other on their own. But the majority of aid that needs to be coordinated through the border crossings, mostly through Egypt, some through Israel. And that coordination at the border and then distribution does happen through the UN. And our concern is that UN officials and other humanitarian organizations have been directly targeted. We know there have been dozens and dozens and dozens of humanitarian workers killed in Gaza. And so that makes it incredibly unsafe to get on the road in these trucks in the hope of, getting to your destination. On the question of, I think it's a question on cash availability. There are 2 functioning ATMs in all of Gaza, so you can imagine the challenge there. In many humanitarian contexts, Oxfam prioritizes distributing cash rather than distributing food or supplies, because it's a way to provide aid in a way that's dignified. Families can decide what they want to spend their cash on. They know best what they need. So usually that's what we would prioritize. In Gaza right now, that is not our main approach, because first, there isn't much cash on hand, and then secondly, there's virtually no markets for purchasing. So in Gaza right now, we're focusing more on direct distribution of hygiene kits, food, trucking in of water, providing water supplies, building up latrines, hand washing stations, etc. So the cash situation is certainly a difficult one, and our ways of working in Gaza are in every way different than what we're providing right now, for example, in South Sudan and Somalia, in other humanitarian circumstances.
Yeah. And actually, speaking of the cash, we have a piece coming up in the next couple of days about the cost of food, and really looking at pre-October and today what a kilo of rice or tomato or paper to make some fire costs, and it's some pretty shocking numbers. So that's coming up. For the next question, we've seen a lot on TV, but what things did you observe on the ground that's not covered in the news? What misconceptions or misinformation do you think that the rest of the world, or that's quite grand, but that folks have regarding what's happening in Gaza?
Yeah, I think the main misconception is that humanitarian organizations like are facing logistical challenges in getting aid to people. We are not facing logistical challenges, and I want to be very clear here. We are facing the deliberate withholding humanitarian aid by the Israeli Defense Forces within Gaza. This is not a logistical challenge. We work in some of the most complicated places in the world. We know how to deal with logistics. I'm speaking for Oxfam, but aid organizations know how to deal with complicated situations. What we are seeing is a deliberate blocking of movement of goods within Gaza, so that even when aid has gone through the very difficult process of getting across the border into Gaza, trucks are not allowed to circulate freely. We've seen that there has been now what is essentially a border created between north of Gaza and south of Gaza by the Israeli forces that is cutting off aid from getting from south to north and north to south. These are deliberate attempts to control aid delivery. And for months now, Oxfam has been speaking about the use of starvation as a weapon of war. We do not use these words lightly. We see a deliberate withholding of food and other aspects of humanitarian aid, which are directly harming and killing the civilian population. And so I just want to press this point because logistical challenges are one thing. The deliberate trampling of international humanitarian law is another one, and that's what we really need to keep our eye on. And the implications of that will go far beyond what we're witnessing in Gaza today, far beyond a ceasefire, far beyond the reconstruction of Gaza. If we're not standing up in defense of international humanitarian law today, then who will for the next emergency that comes up? I really do believe that our international human rights and humanitarian law frameworks are at risk if the international community does not speak up in defense of these principles in this specific context.
Yeah. And in regards to that, actually, there's a question, and it reminds me of one of the partner organizations. I believe it was Stars of Hope that we spoke with. Maybe you can share a little story from that. But we have a question here. Can you speak more about the partner organizations that Oxfam is working with in Gaza, including any women's organizations? Yeah.
What's interesting is that we've had offices, staff, and partners in Gaza for years. So we're working with the organizations that we had been working with previously on women's empowerment projects, on economic initiatives. So organizations we have really long-standing relationships with. In the previous question, you're asking about kind of what are the challenges of what is not seen. I can share an anecdote that was shared with me and that literally left me floored when I was there. One of our partners was explaining that their focus is on working with people with disabilities in Gaza, and they've been doing this work for many, many years, focus on women and women. And Oxfam, with the support of the Canadian government and donations across Canada, supports their efforts with the community. And they were explaining to me that over the past months, they've been trying to get wheelchairs and hearing aids, in particular hearing aids for kids into Gaza, for kids that have been wounded and lost their hearing in the bombings and the conflict over the past 8 months. And they were saying that all of these goods, so in particular wheelchairs and hearing aids, were blocked at the border by the Israeli Defense Forces because they consider these dual use or potentially lethal imports. So just the idea that a hearing aid for a child would be considered dangerous and then is being withheld from kids when there's the ability to provide that. I mean, that's the level of withholding of humanitarian aid that I was speaking about and that our partners are challenged with on a day-to-day basis. Another thing to know about our partners is that most of them have offices both in Gaza and in the West Bank. And those in the West Bank are desperately wanting to provide aid to their colleagues and to communities in Gaza, and they're not allowed to. So you cannot drive a truck from the West Bank to Gaza going through Israel. That is impossible. And so, these organizations that have incredible goodwill, knowledge of the communities, the willingness to respond are not able to be part of the response because of these kind of, it's not even administrative hoops, it's the actual total withholding of freedom of movement for them within the Palestinian territory.
I think it's so important to understand too, like again, I keep going back to the geography, and something that just in relation when you're talking about the having Palestinian partners maybe in the West Bank that could supply to Gaza. We're talking here about 100 kilometers, 2 hours away, when depending on if with checkpoints and whatnot. Like we're not talking about major distances, so it's quite infuriating to hear this. We have a question here about our staff. Are the Oxfam staff that are working in Gaza and surrounding areas, are they staying there by choice? Do they have the option to leave? Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So in essence, no one has the option to leave Gaza today. A few of our staff and our families were able to kind of get through the border crossing and into Egypt. So we have a few colleagues who have been able to flee, but they are the exception. Most cannot make it out. And even those who have made it into Egypt, speaking to them was difficult because they fled the direct threat of bombs and hunger, but now are living in limbo in Egypt. They don't have, work permits. That they don't have a home for themselves, and they don't really have a prospect of returning home, because even once there's a ceasefire, they have no sense of what they could return to. Their houses are destroyed. There's no school for their kids, probably no hospital. So our staff in Gaza are in the midst of the most hellish situation. And then the few who have gotten out are in limbo with kind of no prospects for where to go in the future. Every single staff that we have from Gaza is in an incredibly precarious and difficult situation. And for us, our primary focus is on the duty of care to our own colleagues, obviously. And under these circumstances, what we're able to do is thankfully, our offices and our warehouses haven't been bombed, so those are places for shelter. Trying to get as much support that we can to them directly. But even in our duty of care as an employer, our hands are so tied because we don't have access to them. They don't have access to us. I am just thankful that communication is still holding and that we can have that lifeline of connection through phone calls and video calls, and just at least knowing every morning when we wake up, are all 23 still alive and safe?
Yeah, that was one of the conversations, and I'm sure you would agree, Lauren, that really stood out of just speaking with our Gaza staff. And they were talking about their strategies of sleeping in the same room with their families just in case they get bombed, so at least they're together. And it's just things like that you just, yeah, that will haunt you forever. We have time for one more question. We have so many questions. I'm gonna try and see if there's a way that we could answer them on social media at a later time, because there's some really, really great questions. My last one today. So I know Oxfam has a strong focus on water and sanitation, so I'm curious how that is going. Can Oxfam begin to tackle this issue, or are they being blocked in this regard? This is quite a long question, but yeah. Let's keep it to that if we focus on water.
Yeah. So within kind of the humanitarian world, all organizations coordinate on the ground and are coordinated by the UN often, and our focus is on water and sanitation, and that's what we're doing in Gaza. We struggled for many months at the beginning of the conflict because a lot of what we were going to bring into Gaza are things like pipes and equipment to build up, rebuild, repair water treatment facilities, wastewater treatment facilities, desalination plants, and those materials, those metal pipes, were being blocked kind of systematically at the border. So that was very challenging. A lot of what we're doing today is either trucking in water or plants. Gaza is on the sea. Everyone's looking at water, but you can't drink salt water. So big focus is on desalination. Also, we are providing portable hand washing stations, and this is really important because we're seeing a huge outbreak of disease when everyone is crammed together in an area that might have had maybe 100,000 people. When you have 700,000 people with a couple of toilets, a couple of showers, disease spread very quickly. So we're focused on hand washing stations, menstrual hygiene kits, water tablets, and again, just things to transport water. People literally have nothing anymore. Most families have moved 3, 4, 5, 6 times in the last 8 months. Every time you're losing something else. So now at the very best, you have a tarp and maybe your foldable jerry can. So we're really trying to make our response as portable as possible so that it can be following people who are on the move and kind of reinventing the playbook of what it means to provide water and sanitation in these conditions. Caho, I think you're on mute.
It wouldn't be a Zoom call without one "Are you on mute?" Comment. Thank you. So we're nearly at time. I just wanted to ask you, Lauren, if you had any last words for today's call.
What I would say is that Oxfam has been a humanitarian organization for 80 years, and it is core to our mandate. We've also always been an advocacy organization because we believe in speaking truth to power and really looking at the systemic causes of the injustices, the crises, the conflicts, the humanitarian catastrophes that we work on. And in this moment in time, the two are really coming together. We cannot do good advocacy on this crisis without having our teams on the ground that are telling us firsthand what they're witnessing. And we cannot provide a humanitarian response without using our advocacy voice to call for access, for respect for international humanitarian law, and for an end to the hostilities, and calling for a ceasefire. And so while kind of putting those two things together, kind of humanitarian commitment, advocacy, and also long-term partnerships in communities. This has always been kind of Oxfam's modus operandi, but in this moment of time, it's really more relevant than ever. And, it's been fabulous to see Canadians come on board and understand that, yes, we need and are thankful for your donations. We need them to keep coming because the needs are immense, but we also need you with us, standing with us and raising your voices, and your voices are heard. And, it's one thing to raise money for a response. It's another to say, 200, 300,000 Canadians are standing with us, demanding a respect for human rights and international humanitarian law. It's incredibly powerful. And so, if I think back to the trip, so many people, so many of my colleagues that I met with in the West Bank said, thank you, Canada, for standing with us. People see it in this age of social media. The actions that you're taking are seen. And I feel very grateful for the Oxfam community in Canada, but around the world, that is really mobilizing in such a forceful way to stand up for peace and human rights.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Lauren. And speaking of, I wouldn't be doing my job right if I didn't invite everyone to follow us online on social media. So you can find us on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, whatever you want not whatever you want, but with our handle Oxfam at Oxfam Canada. You can also stay subscribed to emails for important updates. And that about covers our afternoon together. Last but not least, I just wanted to thank everyone in the room for carving out some time to listen to these stories. It absolutely means the world to our teams. So thank you so much and have a great day.